Ever pour your heart into a project, feel that creative fire, and then bam, you hit a wall when it's time to actually share it with the world.
It's the worst.
Today, we're diving deep into that very struggle. Procrastination, but not the kind you might expect. We're going way beyond, those to-do lists and discipline, straight into this fascinating world of the subconscious.
We've got a really unique vantage point for this deep dive, too. A hypnotherapy training session.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it gives you incredibly raw insight into the unconscious blocks that even, like, seasoned professionals can face.
Wow. So we're basically listening in on a session? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
So we're listening to Virginie. She's an expert hypnotherapist,
Yeah.
and she's working with her trainee, Marie, and their subject is Sophie. And here's where it gets interesting. Sophie herself is a successful hypnotherapist.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so this isn't just about, you know, like struggling to meet deadlines. It's about something much deeper holding her back.
I see. So she understands this stuff, she gets it, and yet she's still struggling.
Exactly. And you hear it right away. Like, she's not lacking discipline at all, right?
Hmm.
She's successful professionally. She's driven. But when it comes to those personal projects, especially those close to her heart, there's this invisible barrier.
Yeah, you can almost hear like the frustration in her voice when she talks about having all these ideas, like workshops planned out in her mind, and then nothing. The momentum's just gone.
Right. And it's in those moments that the unconscious mind really reveals itself.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that phrase she uses? She says, it feels like she's missing a thread. That, to me, speaks volumes.
Mm.
It suggests something way deeper than just, oh, I lack a little willpower. Something else is going on.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting when she talks about actually enjoying the creative process, like feeling energized by it. It's when it's time to share her work that the roadblock appears, like almost a fear of exposure or judgment.
Exactly. And this is where the whole concept of the ego becomes so relevant.
Yeah.
And I don't mean ego in the sense of arrogance, but that inner voice that's always seeking external validation, that fear that what we create might not be like good enough or original enough or helpful enough.
Oh, I know that voice so well.
Right.
Yeah, which is so fascinating because she even acknowledges that she's received positive feedback in the past when she has shared her work.
Right. So logically, she knows it has value.
Right.
But that fear, but what if it's not enough? That's the ego clinging to the need for external approval. And honestly, it can be one of the most powerful blocks to our creative potential.
Absolutely. And that's something I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to, especially if you're in a creative field or putting your work out there for the world to see. It's scary.
It's incredibly common.
Yeah.
This fear of not measuring up can be like totally paralyzing. What's so powerful about this session is that it lets us witness how Sophie begins to unpack that fear, giving us a framework to maybe address it in our own lives.
I love that. Okay, so let's get into it. This is where the session takes a turn toward the tangible, right? Tell me about this wall she describes.
Ah, yes, the wall.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. It becomes like the central metaphor for understanding her block.
Mm.
She visualizes it in her plexus solar region, which is interesting in itself, right?
Yeah.
Because that area is so often associated with our sense of self-worth, confidence.
Right. Right. Okay, so we're not just talking about a figurative wall here. This is like a physical manifestation of a mental block. That's powerful stuff.
It is. It highlights just how deeply ingrained these subconscious patterns can be. Now remember, Virginie, being the skilled hypnotherapist that she is, she doesn't just try to demolish this wall.
Right.
She's much more gentle. Instead, she guides Sophie to explore it.
Okay, interesting. So it makes you wonder, what's the purpose of this wall? Like, if it's there to protect her, what is it protecting her from?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And through really carefully crafted questions, Virginie helps Sophie uncover the answer. She leads her to realize that this wall, intimidating as it feels, is actually trying to protect her from being seen.
Protecting her from what, though? What's so scary about being seen, especially when she's already a successful professional in her field?
That's the paradox of the ego, isn't it?
Oh.
Because even when we do achieve that external validation, that fear of judgment, of criticism, of just not being good enough can linger. It's such a deeply ingrained fear. And for Sophie, this wall, it represents that. It's her subconscious's attempt to shield herself from that potential pain.
So it's less about like physically being seen, but more about her work being seen, judged, potentially rejected.
Yes.
It becomes this very personal fear that I think so many creatives can relate to.
Exactly. It's that vulnerability that comes with pouring your heart and soul into something
Mm.
and then putting it out there for the world,
Right.
knowing that not everyone's going to connect with it.
Of course.
Or worse, some people might even criticize it.
It makes you wonder, like, if that fear of exposure is so ingrained, how do you even begin to, I don't know, break down a wall that's built from that?
Right. And that's where the power of shifting perspective comes in,
Yeah.
Because as Sophie's interacting with this wall, metaphorically guided by Virginie, something incredible happens. This wall that felt so impenetrable, so real to her, it starts to change.
What, like, crumble? Does
Yeah.
it fade away?
In a sense, yeah, but it's more nuanced than that.
Mm.
She describes it as becoming movable, like she suddenly has agency over it. So imagine that, realizing that
Yeah.
this massive barrier wasn't made of stone after all, but something more, I don't know, malleable, something you could potentially move through.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how the shift in perception can be so powerful. If the wall represents her fear, then realizing she has, like, some control over it, even just metaphorically, I bet that's got to be, like, incredibly freeing.
It is, and it highlights something really crucial here, because it shows that overcoming procrastination, especially when it's rooted in fear, isn't always about, brute force or willpower. Sometimes it's just about shifting our relationship to that fear, recognizing that it doesn't have to hold us captive.
So the wall becoming movable kind of represents Sophie gaining a sense of agency over that fear, but, like, does it actually disappear, or is it more about learning to, like, navigate around it?
So according to her experience in the session, the wall does eventually disappear entirely.
Wow.
But here's the catch. It's not Virginie who makes it vanish. It kind of dissolves on its own as Sophie's perception of it changes.
Wow, that's a really good point. It's not about external forces removing our obstacles, but, like, about the internal work we do to actually shift our perspective and kind of, like, empower ourselves.
Precisely. And remember, we're dealing with the subconscious mind here, which, thrives on symbolism and imagery. So the wall disappearing might represent a much deeper shift in her belief system, a release of that fear-based thinking that was holding her back.
So it makes you wonder, though, is that shift in perception enough? Because even after the wall is gone, she brings up another layer to this whole internal struggle, right? She talks about this conflict between her ego and her heart, particularly when it comes to, her desire to write and lead workshops.
Yes, exactly. This is where the deep dive gets even more interesting, because remember, that wall was just a symptom. It was a manifestation of a deeper fear.
Right.
So removing the wall doesn't automatically erase the underlying fear itself.
Right. Okay. So even without the wall there, she's still, like, wrestling with these doubts about her own motivation.
Exactly. And she voices this concern, that her desire to write and lead these workshops, she's worried might be coming from a place of ego, whereas her hypnotherapy work feels more pure, more
Yeah.
heart-centered. And this distinction is crucial because it reveals a potential internal conflict that I think so many of us face.
Oh, yeah. It's that classic struggle of, like, am I doing this for the right reasons? Or am I just seeking validation? Which is something I think a lot of creatives probably grapple with, especially when transitioning from, like, that one-on-one work to more of a public platform.
Absolutely. And Sophie's experience here, it offers a really powerful insight into how this conflict can actually fuel procrastination.
Okay.
Because, if we believe that a part of us, the ego part, is driving this desire to create, it can create a sense of internal resistance.
Because we associate ego with, like, all those external validation-seeking desires.
Exactly.
Which can feel, like, at odds with the purity of, like, creating from the heart.
Yes. And that internal conflict can be really paralyzing. It's like having, one foot on the gas pedal and the other one on the brake at the same time.
Totally. So if the wall represented, like, the fear of judgment, this whole ego versus heart conflict, that seems like it's, like, a whole other deeper layer, like questioning one's own motivations and, like, authenticity.
Yeah.
So how does she begin to navigate this new terrain?
Well, this is really interesting. The answer might lie in her own words. Remember how she described her hypnotherapy work? She said she never questions her why when she's in those sessions.
Right. She's, like, in the flow.
It's just pure intuitive connection, a desire to help others tap into their own potential.
Yeah. She's just fully present in those moments, not worried about judgment or, like, is my approach original enough and all that stuff.
Exactly. And that suggests that the key to overcoming her procrastination might lie in finding ways to align her other creative endeavors with that same sense of genuine connection.
So instead of, like, focusing on whether her ideas are original enough, she could focus on how she can share them in a way that feels, authentic and connected to like her own experiences and values.
Exactly. It's about shifting from that place of what will people think to how can I share this in a way that feels true to myself?
Hmm.
It's about prioritizing that heart-centered connection over the ego's need for approval.
That's such a powerful distinction. I love that. So it's almost like she's found the antidote to like her own procrastination poison by tapping into that same energy that she brings to her hypnotherapy sessions, that sense of like pure connection and service. She can potentially unlock those creative blocks.
Yeah, and that might involve exploring like different avenues for her work too.
Yeah.
If she thrives in that direct one-on-one setting, maybe smaller workshops, online communities, or even a podcast
Oh, interesting.
where she can have more like intimate conversations that might feel more aligned with her strengths.
It's about finding that right format, that environment where she can really show up authentically without feeling like she has to conform to like all those external expectations.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something for all of us to consider, not just creators, like what are those areas in our lives where we feel most naturally aligned,
Mm.
most genuinely ourselves? Where do we like completely lose track of time and we just feel that sense of flow and purpose?
Because those are often the spaces where our procrastination just dissolves.
Yeah.
It just disappears. And like our true potential can kind of emerge.
Exactly. And sometimes it's not about forcing ourselves to do what we think we should be doing, but about giving ourselves permission to explore those areas where we just feel most alive,
Right.
most connected to those authentic selves.
It's such a subtle shift, but it's so profound. Like it's not about abandoning our goals. It's just about approaching them from a place of, greater self-awareness and alignment.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real magic happens.
Right.
When we can align our actions with our values, our work with our hearts,
Mm.
that's when we really tap into this wellspring of creativity and productivity
Yeah.
that honestly we never even knew we possessed.
Yeah. This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've gone from like, to-do lists and discipline to subconscious blocks, metaphorical walls, and the power of like aligning with our authentic selves.
Right. It's amazing what we can learn from just like listening to someone else's journey of self-discovery.
Absolutely. A huge thank you to Sophie, Virginie, and Marie for allowing us to learn from their session. And for you listening in, the next time you find yourself facing that familiar wall of procrastination, remember Sophie's story. Ask yourself, what fear might this wall be protecting me from? And, how can I connect more deeply with my own authentic expression, my own why, to really unlock that creative potential that's waiting there inside? Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep diving deep.